For our next panel, we tackle the question of sustainability. As both governments and companies worldwide pledge to achieve net zero emissions of greenhouse gases, what would it take to fulfill the ambition? Please welcome our panelists, Sassoon Grigorian, Vice President, Government Affairs and Public Policy, APAC and Japan, Salesforce. Ashutosh Chadha, Director and Country Head, Public Policy and Government Affairs, Microsoft India. Neeraj Sinha, Senior Advisor, Science and Technology, Niti Aayog. Sandeep Chakravarti, Joint Secretary, Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India. Varad Pandey, Partner, Omidyar Network India. Sharmila Varathan, President, Government Affairs and Policy, General Electric, South Asia. The panel will be moderated by Anirudh Suri, non-resident scholar, Carnegie, India.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am super delighted to have a full house here for this panel on promoting sustainability transition to a net zero economy. We have an excellent mix of perspectives here on the panel on this topic today. And obviously, we stand between lunch and all of you, so we're going to keep it crisp, yet provocative. What I'm going to do is I'll set up the framework for the conversation very quickly in the next couple of minutes, and then we'll jump in. Climate and sustainability is often seen as a challenge and a crisis, but the way we're going to frame the discussion here today is of it as an opportunity, as an economic opportunity for India, obviously for the world. And really what we're going to try and get the panel to share with us is how do we make that opportunity real? How do we achieve progress on that opportunity as India? And the reason I call it an opportunity is, as many of you are familiar with climate technology, and emerging trends in that, you'll be aware that this set of climate technologies that is now entering our economy have the possibility and the potential to completely transform our economy, transform the fundamental pillars of our economy, how we create, how we produce, and who are the key winners and losers. And as a result, given this is a once-in-an-era type economic opportunity, I believe for India it'll be very important to catch this wave early, right? And hence a proper framework for capturing this opportunity is needed. I believe the key pillars of the framework that I wanted to lay out and then bring our panelists on are 5 or 6 main pillars. One is finance or capital for this transition. Second is the talent and the skills needed for India to make this transition. Third is technology. Fourth is what are the enabling policies we'll need. The fifth is strategy. What kind of role we expect different actors, corporates, startups, government, diplomats, our foreign service, everyone to play in this transition. And finally, and this I will credit Varad and our conversation yesterday to what kind of consumer behavior changes we need and mindset changes we need in India to make this transition quickly. Having laid out that framework, let me actually bring Varad into the conversation first. Varad, with your work at Omidyar, obviously you've been working extensively on, and I know you've worked on climate in the past as well, many years ago as well. So I wanted to ask you, what do you see as the key pillars of what India's climate finance strategy should look like? Obviously, we want capital from outside to flow in also. So maybe you can talk about what a broad climate finance strategy for India looks like. What are the key priorities? Who will be the key institutions that will be important for us? What are gaps domestically that we need to fill?
Thanks, Anirudh, and it's fantastic to be here with this great panel. And I think it's a sign of our times that climate change and sustainability has got a pride of place in the Global Tech Summit. I think, as I always say, I think over the last 10 years, we've had a lot of discussion on how digital can be such a big transformation for humanity. And I think for the next 10 years, we'll be having a lot of conversation on how climate and sustainability is not just, as you said, a crisis, but a massive opportunity for us to change the trajectory of our society. I think it's also very interesting that we are having this conversation on the day that India has taken on its G20 presidency. And firstly, it's, I think, the fact that we've got one Earth in our motto for the G20 and not one world is symbolic of the fact of the importance of environment and climate in that agenda. But also because 80% of all carbon emissions are actually done by G20 countries. So if there's a platform that can make a massive dent on the problem and on the solution set, G20 is definitely one of them. Now, coming to your question on finance, see, at the highest level, I think there are two problems we are facing on climate finance. The first is that the need for climate finance runs into trillions of dollars. All the estimates that we see say we need about $3 to $5 trillion of incremental capital every year for the next 20 years. Now, that's like so many zeros, it's very hard to imagine that number. But the contrast it with the conversation, the global conversation, which is on billions. So we need trillions, but we're talking billions. In the UNFCCC process, there's been a long-standing goal, which started in 2009 Copenhagen Summit, that there should be $100 billion which should flow on climate finance by 2020. We're ending 2022, we are still not anywhere near that 100 billion. So, and I give credit to Janet Yellen for this framing, that we are discussing billions when we should be spending trillions, right? So that's one big problem. The other big problem, and as an investor in this space that we see, is that 80% of the climate capital is going to just two sectors, and that's renewable energy and transport, which roughly contribute to about 40% of emissions. So 80% of capital is going to 40% of the problem. We need to change that mix. So the bottom line, I think, of the problem at the highest level, we need to massively scale the capital, grow the pie, and we need to cut the pie a little differently and get more money to go to sectors like industry, like forests, like agriculture, which are going to be a very, very important part of the solution if we are to solve this crisis for humanity. So that's the problem. Now, in terms of the solutions, I would like to share two very, very concrete things which I think can help unlock the capital and the massive scale of capital that we need. The first idea is this idea of blended finance, right? I think recognizing the fact that public funding, unfortunately, is not going to be sufficient to solve this problem. Recognizing that the traditional official development assistance financial flows are not going to be of order of magnitude of what we need. And recognizing that the private sector by itself is not going to come into play for a lot of spaces that we really care about. Renewable energy, perhaps we have solved the problem. But many other spaces, it's not going to happen. We need public, private, philanthropic sectors to come together to think of catalytic new financial mechanisms to actually get this capital unlock. And these could range from, and happy to go into this later if of interest, everything from differentiated equity structures where philanthropic or public capital can take on subordinate equity while the private sector can take on the conventional equity. It could include things like guarantees, which can play a major role in the risk perception and unlocking capital flows, especially to the global south, and many other mechanisms. And I think in this context, and this ties back to the G20, there's a massive role for reimagining our multilateral development banks, the World Bank, the Asian Development Bank, and so on, who need to think of themselves not as lending banks, but as leverage banks. How can they, instead of saying, we do $200 billion of lending, can we take it to $300 billion? How can on their $200 billion raise $2 trillion for this problem? So we need, and I think the G20, which are the major shareholders of the multilateral development banks, have a massive opportunity to change the governance, change the practices so that this unlock happens, right? So that's pillar number one, blended capital, massive opportunity. Second pillar, I would say, is carbon markets. I think economics 101, right? That markets are a very efficient way to transfer capital. They send the right price signals, and so on and so forth. But this is a topic which is, the carbon markets have been around now for about 20 years. They were part of the original Kyoto Protocol. We had the CDM and all of that stuff. It's been a mixed experience. Actually, a lot of people are very skeptical for many reasons. The quality of the projects, the kind of measurement issues, integrity, passing the buck, by buying carbon credits. It's a very tough topic.
That's right.
But we have to solve the problem. And I think, again, here the India opportunity is very important. We have recently, earlier this year, introduced amendments to the Energy Conservation Act, which will enable India to have a carbon market for the first time. And we have two fantastic examples in India, or in the last decade, of actually trying out market-based environmental actions. One of them, many of you will be familiar with, called the Perform, Achieve and Trade Scheme, which was implemented by the Bureau of Energy Efficiency, which has brought up the energy efficiency of our key industrial sectors and power plants by introducing a market-based mechanism. Lots of learnings from how that was done. And a very interesting pilot which has been done over the last 4 or 5 years in Gujarat, actually, in the city of Surat, to do an emissions trading scheme of a pollutant called PM 2.5, which is the dominant ambient pollution in India, which actually brought down emissions in Surat by 27% without zero incremental cost to industries. So I think I'll leave with the thought that the problem is immense. We are talking billions when we should talk trillions. The mix has to change. And I think the two big unlocks for this problem are blended capital, by changing the role of the multilateral development banks, and getting carbon markets that actually work for us.
Great. And if Delhi gets on this PM 2.5 trading, I think all of us Delhiites could be super rich if somehow that could become a currency. Sharmila, let me bring you in on a different aspect of the solution here, which is the role of corporations. Right? You represent a corporation that is probably one of the most emblematic corporations of the industrial era. As we move to an era that is trying to undo many of the choices that were made during the industrial era that continue to now haunt us in many ways on the energy side. What do you see as the role of corporations in this transition? Not just from the perspective of GE and each corporation going net zero, but also in contributing to the larger task at hand.
So let me begin by congratulating Carnegie for your thought leadership role that you play in the country, and for this signature event which I've attended since its inception. So GE, throughout its 130-year history, has always had a larger purpose to innovating technology, which is to improve the quality of life of billions of people. And that's a core driver for sustainability. In 2021, we articulated our aim to become a net zero company by 2050, not just from the operations itself within GE, but also for the emissions from the use of our sold products. Our own sustainability report will share how innovation drives businesses to address 3 pressing global challenges. The first one being energy transition to drive decarbonization. The second one is around delivering precision health that personalizes treatments and diagnosis. And the third one is the future of flight, which is smarter and more efficient. The question, as you said, is why should corporations even be looking at it? And I think it's consequential because I'll tell you about at least GE's reach. 1/3 of the global energy generation is on GE technology. 3 out of 4 commercial aircrafts around the world carry either a GE or a partner engine. And then the third is around precision health. We have about 4 million plus. And so plus installations, and therefore, the consequence of what you do is significant and imperative. And so therefore we focus on changes in technology that bring about CO2 emission reduction and fuel efficiency improvements across aviation energy. I'll just very quickly dwell on 2 or 3 examples on the aviation side, the future of flight. Today you have something like a 40% reduction in fuel consumption and a 40% CO2 emission reduction of the engines today in our aircrafts, both GE and the CFM engines, as compared to that which was in 70s and 80s. And what you're looking at for the future of flight is an additional 20% fuel efficiency. We also partner with industry initiatives on to approve and adopt 100% sustainable aviation fuel. On the energy front, we have innovative onshore wind and offshore wind technologies, very efficient gas turbines, and advanced technology that modernizes and digitizes the grid. The future which we're focusing on is carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and also things like low and zero carbon hydrogen combustion in gas turbines. So that's the spectrum of technology innovation that's going around. So I'll stop there and turn it back to you, Anirudh. Thank you.
Yeah, can I ask you a follow-up question? So
Yes,
as GE, and as we make this big transition, right, from the industrial era to, I believe, more climate era, what kind of companies does GE worry the most about when it comes to possible disruption of GE and its larger business?
So,
Is there a
think-
worry of that, or is that something that...
Yeah, I think we worry about disruption amongst our own selves as to, you were here today, how much should you disrupt to be in the next gen?
Correct.
That's the way, and I would actually say we have a more collaborative and a collective approach to such things. And I'll give you the recent example at COP27, we announced what is called a corporate coalition on innovation and technology towards net zero. CCITNZ, I think I got that right. Which is founded by 6 companies, GE, Bechtel, GM, Johnson Controls, Invergy, and I'm missing one, I think. So anyway, all of us together co-founded this. This is an accelerator for industry across sectors and geographies, and the focus is on how do you address climate change. So I'd look at it more as a collective, collaborative approach within the industry to see how you disrupt for the future.
Sure. Ashutosh, let me bring you in now. You represent Microsoft, a company that's counted amongst, obviously, one of the big tech firms of today. As I was asking Sharmila, there were energy choices made during the industrial era that have later come back to haunt us. There are many who say that there are energy choices being made by big tech firms today, and certain technologies that are obviously very energy intensive. I think yesterday or day before, Nivruti, for example, from Intel mentioned how much water, I think millions of liters of water a day that's required for a fab. We've heard about the energy intensiveness of blockchain technology, etc. So my question to you is this: how are big tech firms thinking about their own energy footprint? Because if you all don't think about the energy choices wisely today, then of course the world again comes back to regret the energy choices that were made by some of the largest corporations today. So maybe you can share with us how both you at Microsoft and generally big tech firms are thinking about the energy footprint that's being left by the technologies you are introducing to the world, but also broadly that are getting adopted globally.
Thanks, Anirudh. Good point. And I'd like to sort of step back and say that, paint the context. The nature today and the benefits that it provides us from a health, from an ecosystem, ecology perspective is all that's driving the economy and society at this point of time. It's currently under stress. So, and I don't think at any point of time, and which is why all of us are here and we are having this conversation, and like you said, it's been decades and we've been having this conversation, but it's sort of bubbled up. I think it's incumbent upon each one of us to see what can we do to improve it. But at Microsoft, as you said, we look at it from 3 perspectives. One is, how do we need to get our house in order, right? our own carbon footprint or in energy consumption? How do we need to make our own technology more, I wouldn't say energy resistant, but contributing less to this sustainable chaos that we are seeing around us? Second, how do we work with our customers, partners, and vendors to make them more efficient also? And the third is around the entire piece around how do we work to drive policies and skills to make sure that we prepare ourselves better for the future. So this is the way that we at Microsoft look at our engagement over here. On the first piece, if you look at it, our focus is very clear. We have taken the pledge to become carbon negative, water positive, and a zero waste company by 2030. That's very clear. And we realize it's not an easy task. We came out, for example, in 2021 with our report, and we found that despite our business going up by 15 to 20% or whatever that number was in the previous year, our scope 1, scope 2 emissions, they did come down by 17%, which was good. But scope 3 went up by 21% or so, 22%. And it's a difficult, and managing scope 3 is always a very difficult issue.
Correct.
Right? Which is why that second pillar which I talked about, which is working with our customer, partners, vendors, etc., becomes extremely important. Making sure our technology takes in lesser and lesser of energy becomes extremely important. And the third piece to that is when we start looking at the data centers that we are setting up globally, how do we make sure that they use more and more renewable energy, and they don't deplete the grid or contribute to carbon emissions as much as they should. So from that perspective, that's what we're moving towards. And our goal is that our data centers should become self-sustainable from that perspective.
Do you have a target for that?
We do have targets for that. I don't offhand remember the dates for that, but we definitely have a clear direction as far as that is concerned. And the other important thing that we need to look at is we believe the role of big tech and technology companies is also going to be to see how do we measure, monitor, and use that data to effectively implement policies to address these sustainability issues. You talked about a very important point, right? That 80% of the capital is going into areas which possibly contribute to 40%. And I think that's one of the issues. If we can slice where the emissions are coming from, if we can monitor the data as far as that is concerned effectively, and we can use intelligence to figure out what needs to be done to address that, that's where technology can help. So as big tech companies, it's not just important for us to reduce what we are contributing, but it's also important for us to make sure that we create technological solutions to enable others to figure out how to do the right thing.
No, absolutely. And I'm going to come and dig deeper on that point with you in a second, but I want to bring in Sassoon. Sassoon, you represent Salesforce. You've recently come out with a report that talks about what technologies can be adopted to, I think, Ashutosh's point, to help India make that net zero transition faster. I believe you've mentioned cloud, digital adoption, AI as some of those technologies. So why don't we get a little bit more elaboration on that from your perspective on what India should be doing in terms of leveraging technologies such as the ones you've mentioned in your report, and what might be barriers or obstacles to that adoption today that India should look to remove.
Thank you very much, and thank you to Carnegie for hosting the summit over these past 3 days. So Anirudh, as you mentioned, we did a report recently on India, a Trail to Net Zero for India, and we found that if organizations move to adopt cloud computing, in 2022 they could save up to 2.2 million metric tons in emissions reduction. And that actually increased to 2.8 million metric tons if it was sourced by 100% renewable energy. Now, I think that this decade is going to be the net zero decade. We've got the targets now that many countries have now positioned. It's now the work of trying to implement it. And in the same report, when we look at the decade from 2022 to 2030, if organisations move to the cloud, we found 48 million metric tons emissions reductions, and again, that was converted to 60 million if it was 100% renewable energy. And technology is one part. The advantage, obviously, moving to the cloud is less reliance on servers. Software code makes it more efficient to move data to the cloud, and it also reduces energy costs. So over that 2022-2030 period, for India, that would result in $24 billion worth of savings in energy cost. So that's one thing that we noticed. And as part of that report, we also saw that it's not only environmentally it makes sense, it makes business sense, because 63% of managers in India prefer doing business with suppliers that had net zero targets as well. So that's one thing. And there's obviously challenges and opportunities that comes with that. I think one of the other things we identified was there's going to be a need for sustainability skills. Just like in the economy, we're going to need new skills to power the net zero economy. Whether it's carbon accountants, analysing data, and that's why I think this has been mentioned numerous times during this summit. You can't improve what you can't measure, and this is why it's very important to have people measuring that, having platforms to be able to measure that effectively. And when we hear what's been said over the last 3 days, one thing that's come out very clear in my observations here is that, with the G20 presidency, there's a lot of optimism about India. There's a lot of focus on India, particularly in digital capability. India has the opportunity to be the talent hub, or as I like to call it, the digital human capital of the globe. And you're going to need that digital human capital and sustainable skills to be able to achieve your targets. So that's an area I think is a huge opportunity. The third element, I think, where there's a great opportunity here, especially in relation to technology, is the concept of ecopreneurs. So I'm of the view that the next wave of unicorns in the technology space are going to be companies that are ecopreneurs. Who are ecopreneurs? These are people that are, have technology companies to address environmental issues. It could be in packaging, it could be in agri-tech, in agriculture, like water efficiency. It could be, how can we transform renewable energy and, shift that to existing grids that we're consuming energy from. So ecopreneurs are going to have a huge role. So that is a huge opportunity, particularly for India. But we think that technology is going to have a big role to play, and these are just some observations that I think that's come through.
No, great. I wanted to bring Mr. Chakrabarti in. I think you've mentioned G20. Varad, you mentioned G20. We've discussed COP. Yesterday, or day before rather, External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar also mentioned that as India thinks about its own growth story, technology has to be a key part of India's rise, and partnerships have to be a key part of India's rise. So Mr. Chakrabarti, maybe I can ask you, what kind of role is sustainability and the green agenda playing as we think about our diplomatic agenda for the next decade? One. Second, what kind of institutional partners or institutional platforms do we need to advance some of the agenda that India needs to advance on the green side of things? And finally, is there a role you see more for institutions like G20 here and COP and platforms like that? Or do you believe that, much like we are seeing in other areas of national security, bilateral partnerships or smaller regional partnerships like, let's say, the Quad on the security side, will we see something similar on the energy and green side?
Thank you, Anirudh, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. Today we assume presidency of G20, and very interestingly, Prime Minister has written op-eds in major global newspapers, and he says the world faces 3 challenges, and he starts with climate change. So I think climate is informing our national policies and also Indian diplomacy in a major way. I was preparing for this panel. I was just looking at the sustainability or the green agenda that I deal with in my portfolio. My portfolio is very small. It deals with 10 countries in West Europe and the EU. And I was myself quite surprised that despite MEA not being the climate change ministry, where the negotiations are handled by Ministry of Environment and Climate Change, and also we are not involved in the rollout of our policies, that those are mostly done by Ministry of Power or MNRE or even coal and other ministries. But I was seeing that in every relationship, sustainability and climate and the green agenda is taking a big role. So we deal with the world in the multilateral fora. G20, as I think he said, the major emitters are in G20. Then in the UNFCCC, we just finished the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh, and we have read lots of reviews on the outcomes of Sharm el-Sheikh. But I think if we look from India's point of view, the loss and damage fund is a positive step, although we don't know how that will play out. But what I want to say is that in our diplomatic footprint, the domestic priority on climate change, as Prime Minister says, we are turning green not because that the world is asking us to. We need to do it for our own good. And I think the long-term LEDs which we have filed in Sharm el-Sheikh basically makes that point that we have a roadmap towards net zero, and it is our job in MEA that in our relationships with our foreign partners, we see how much we can leverage and channelize technology, finance, expertise, all the 6 pillars that you mentioned, skill, enabling policy, strategy, and lifestyle. I think those conversations are happening on a daily basis. Intense conversations are happening, and if you allow me, I will give you a few examples. For instance, about 7-8 years back, we set up the International Solar Alliance, and it was the first international organization with a base in India. And today it is doing phenomenal work. We set it up in collaboration with France, and I think today we have more than 100 countries part of the ISA, and ISA is rolling out effective solar technologies in many parts of the world which need solar. We have the CDRI, which is very fast becoming a very strong and reputable climate adaptation instrument, and in COP26 we launched the IRIS program for island states. And there is a great deal of interest in our partners in forming part of CDRI. Then we have the One Sun, One World, One Grid program, which was launched in COP26 with the UK. We have bilaterally with every country. For instance, I'll give an example. Germany is one of our largest development partners, and most of the German portfolio in India is on renewables. And when Prime Minister went for the Intergovernmental Commission meeting in May, we signed what is known as the Green and Sustainable Development Partnership. Now, with inputs from all our sister ministries, we actually channelized that, and Prime Minister and Chancellor Scholz signed GSDP worth $10 billion. And only day before yesterday, we signed this year's agreement with Germany, where this year we will get at least 1 billion commitment on. So I'm sorry we're talking of billions, we're supposed to talk of trillions. But at least
1 billion.
no, so 10 billions over the next 6 years. It's also the challenge is, utilization of funds. It's not that funds are not available. We need to have those mechanisms where those monies can be used effectively. It's not easy, let me tell you. to use funds even if they are available. So
Is that because of the strings that come attached to the criteria for that? Or why is that? I would think that there would actually be no issue with
no, it is.
utilization
There
of
are
these.
issues because everything is in an open and transparent process. There is public procurement issues. There are tendering issues. There are environmental clearances. So projects, generally what ails projects implementation in India also ails green projects. I am not trying to hedge here. What I would also like to mention before I end is that with our bilateral development partners. I don't deal with multilateral organizations, but he was mentioning about blended finance. So we are actually working with our development partners on blended finance, and we have never done before in MEA, but this year we set up a fund, blended finance fund called the GIP with the UK, 100 million commitment to start with, but it'll be an alternate investment fund, and our investment manager tells us that we could easily leverage it to 5x or even 10x, and that was with UK, and it'll be used for supporting startups, climate-friendly startups, to take them to the Indo-Pacific and in Africa, and we will give the risk capital to those startups. So we are working in interesting ways, and we are trying to encourage our other development partners like the EU and the Germans and the French to even join in these funds which can be multiplied many times over, and that monies can be used for private sector projects on climate. So, but I'll end by saying that with every partner, climate is top of the agenda, and very soon the German foreign minister will come. Again, she will put that emphasis on climate. And last point is that there's a lot of talk about just energy transition and the G7 top on the agenda. So we are also engaging with the G7, and what we are saying is that it should not be just only for India, it should be just for every partner. So what are your commitments on just energy? It's not that we move out of coal, but there are other fossil based energy which are actually not so clean. In Sharm el Sheikh, this clean fossil and non-clean fossil debate has started. So
and for a moment we thought that India would get that piece across.
Yes. Thank you.
Can I just follow on the bilateral partnerships that you've mentioned, whether it's with the UK, the Germany piece that you mentioned, I believe even with Denmark, India has a green strategic partnership. So when we say it's the top of the agenda for us in many of these cases in our bilateral conversations, what is on that agenda? Is it just finance, as you were mentioning, the billions of dollars that we hope to get within a certain time frame? Or is there more? Is there technology transfer is part of that agenda? What are the key points on that agenda, if you may?
No, it's a very good question. What I want to say is that, traditionally we used to have this very security and defense-based strategic partnerships, like we have with, let's say, France or the US or UK. The leadership told us that, these are okay, but you can have only these strategic partnerships with a few countries with whom you have a defense and security relationship. You can't have a securitized defense strategic partnership with, let's say, Denmark. So, he set us thinking, Prime Minister set us thinking, and then we came up with the green strategic partnership with Denmark. And that has really gone, in less than a year, it is moving. And I think I saw some pictures of the Danish ambassador inaugurating offshore wind projects somewhere in south of India. So again, Denmark is a world leader in offshore wind, and we are seeing rollout of offshore wind. With Netherlands, which is a world leader in water technologies, last year we agreed to a strategic partnership on water, cleaning up of our Ganga. And Netherlands is actively involved in water projects all over India. So it is technology. I would say in these bilateral contexts, sometimes it is less of money, but more of technology, more of know-how, more of experience sharing and skill development.
Correct. No, I think a week or two ago, I was at the Bangalore Tech Summit, and there we had representatives from many of these countries, many of these European countries that fall within your purview as well, Denmark, Netherlands, and even other countries like Israel, that have much to offer in terms of sustainable technology, climate-related technologies, agriculture-related technologies, and even biotech. But on that point of tech now, let me bring in actually Neeraj. We were just speaking right before we came up about some of the work that Niti Aayog has been doing on climate, on sustainability, and specific technologies. Neeraj, a broad question first and then a specific one. The broad question is, from your perspective, what are those core areas or core sectors within this broader climate tech space that you feel India has an edge or a comparative advantage that India should continue or try and leverage so that it can become a massive economic opportunity, let's say 5-10 years down the line for India? That's one. And second, maybe you can talk about some of the recent reports that Niti Aayog has been focusing on. You've mentioned the carbon capture one to me. But maybe we can start with the broader tech opportunity for India from your perspective, and then the specific reports that you've worked on.
Thank you so much. A big thank you, first of all, to Carnegie India for having us here. My personal brush with this entire subject of technological innovation for combating climate change started when I was in the office of the Principal Scientific Advisor to the Government of India. And that was in the year 2008 when the Government of India brought out the National Action Plan on Climate Change. And it's 14 years since then. There were 8 national missions that were outlined in that National Action Plan, and they were all implemented to the hilt. The National Solar Mission, the very successful National Solar Mission of the Ministry of I call it non-conventional energy sources because I started from there in 1989, but now it's called the Ministry of New and Renewable Energy. The NSM came out of that, and the Bureau of Energy Efficiency star rating of domestic alliances also came out of that. Appliances, alliances, and it was the Bureau of Energy Efficiency which did that. There was a national mission on energy efficiency. So we have come a long way from that. Now, Niti Aayog, where I currently work in, we talk about this subject in 3 broad categories. And they're all very distinct categories. One is we talk about technologies that are zero-emission technologies. Now, we all know that they are again of 2 kinds. One is renewable energy, and the second is nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy doesn't get talked about, unfortunately, very much in public fora. I don't know why, but in Niti Aayog, we very recently, in fact, just 4 days ago, we had a joint symposium with the Department of Atomic Energy in Bombay, in the Bhabha Atomic Research Center, on small and modular nuclear reactors. Now, this is one subject which is being promoted by the DAE, by the Niti Aayog, by the Government of India in general, where we don't talk about the typical pressurized heavy water reactors that are conventionally used for nuclear power plant technology. We talk about small reactors, which could be light water reactors in India's context, which are modular, which can be repeated in numbers. And just by repeating in numbers, we increase the number of megawatts or gigawatts that are generated. So there is one area we are focusing on. Renewable energy, of course, has been, the Department of Non-Conventional Sources was started by the Government of India way back in 1982. So we have a 40-year history now. We started very early, and that is an advantage we have. Now, these are the so-called absolutely zero-emission technologies. Then we come to the ones which are polluting in the conventional sense of the word. Coal takes #1 position there, although in COP27, India, according to reports that we have, insisted on not marginalizing coal alone as a polluting technology. Then there are other fossil fuels. Why don't we talk about them? There's oil, there's gas. They're equally polluting. So coal, when burnt efficiently, responsibly, can also continue to remain a mainstay as far as power requirements of a energy-hungry country like India is concerned. Our former vice chairman used to say that India is mandated to grow and grow at a fast pace, but in an environmentally benign manner. Now, that is a very big disadvantage. Countries have grown. They have grown 40 years ago, 50 years ago, 100 years ago, at paces that they determined themselves on their own, but there was no environment concern at that time. Now, we are burdened with the environment concern. We are burdened with the environment responsibility, which we take on ourselves. So when we talk about technologies that are coal technologies that are very high efficiency. We talk about the advanced ultra supercritical technology, where without going into the science, I can broadly say that when you increase the temperature and pressure of steam temperatures at 710 degrees Celsius, steam pressure at 300 bar, from whatever physics we studied in thermodynamics, the Carnot efficiency goes up proportionately. So instead of talking about 41% thermal efficiency for conventional thermal power plants, we talk about 46% thermal efficiency. That consequently brings down the emissions of carbon dioxide fairly substantially. And hence we say that while we continue to burn coal for a few more years, we do it very responsibly and as efficiently as possible. And that AUSA technology, by the way, worldwide is not available commercially anywhere. India has the proud distinction of doing it through a consortium of the NTPC Limited, the BHEL, and the Indira Gandhi Center for Atomic Research, which is a lab of the Department of Atomic Energy in Kalpakkam, which specializes in high temperature materials. We have the design of a 800 megawatt electrical thermal power plant, which is, it's still in discussion stages. The government of India is supposed to support the new technology because all new technologies need government support. It is obviously, an S-curve. The initial cost is going to be high, but when the economies of scale come into play, the cost goes down substantially. So, and the third group is, of course, the so-called polluting technologies, as I said, coal. Now, their carbon capture, utilization, and storage, when we talk about the target that the PM has set the country on, net zero by 2070, that cannot happen by any yardstick if we depend only on renewable, if we depend only on nuclear. We need to continue to depend on the so-called polluting technologies, but we need to also say responsibly that we will not emit any carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. We will capture it, we will convert it into useful products, and hence we will continue to march towards 2070 net carbon neutrality. Now there, I'll club the answer to the second question as well, if you don't mind that.
Yeah.
So there, carbon capture, utilization, and storage has been looked at by the Niti Aayog in a big way. On the 30th of March this year in 2022, we had done an international conference on CCUS, as we call it. Now, CCUS technologies are expensive. According to what was told to the then principal scientific advisor by the then president of the International Energy Agency, I remember the name was Dr. Tanaka. He was a Japanese. So he had told that if there is 1 unit of currency that is spent on a given power plant's commissioning, then there is 1.5 units of money that is required to store the carbon dioxide in the underground geological formations. Take it down 1.5 kilometers. Hence, it is 1.5 times costlier. Now, where do we get the money from? And while public funding is limited, it is there, of course, in big numbers, but it is limited. We need to encourage the industry to continue to contribute, join hands with the government, and probably take care of the financing part to some extent. So CCUS, yes, is, and by the way, we have already embarked. We means the Niti Aayog has already embarked on trying to devise a framework for CCUS in partnership, of course, with the concerned ministries and departments of the Government of India. And there was a report we brought out recently, just a few days ago, that was released by the Vice Chairman Niti Aayog, where we have spoken about a framework for CCUS.
So let me push a little bit further on this technology piece, right? So we've had a solar mission for a while. We mentioned the ISA. We've met many of our solar targets in advance as well of solar production. At the same time, however, the conference is about the geopolitics of technology, and I can't stop myself about this, but we are now realizing that many of the pieces of technology that we needed for solar adoption come from a country that happens to not be on the friendliest terms with us. Right. That's something that we could have anticipated many, many years ago. As we pushed our solar adoption, we could have also figured out a way to build out that manufacturing capacity domestically. Given the criticality of this, is that something you feel has been an oversight in our policy planning and our vision?
See, that touches a raw nerve. See, I used to speak about polysilicon even 15, 17 years ago. Now, India does not manufacture polysilicon. That is the ingot that comes from abroad, which is then sliced just like you slice a loaf of bread and make the cells, and from the cells you make the panels, and from the panels you make the PV systems, the so-called systems that the general public sees. Now, there used to be a company called Metchem, M-E-T-K-E-M, I don't remember the full form now. It was somewhere in Tamil Nadu, which used to make polysilicon 30 years ago. But somehow, we lost on the economies of scale. The rest of the world, especially one of our neighbors, established humongous amounts of polysilicon manufacturing capability.
Exactly.
Brought down the prices.
That's right.
And then when we tried, I mean, I don't want to name companies here, but there was an Indian company which wanted to set up a fairly huge polysilicon manufacturing unit somewhere in India. It had to abandon the project midway because by then the prices of polysilicon had crashed in the domestic market, in the international market, I'm sorry. And there was a time about 12 or 13 years ago when our Indian companies, including those in the public as well as the private sector, were starved of polysilicon. And they were kind of thinking of dismantling their SPV facilities because there was no polysilicon available. It was only coming from Germany at that time. So when the neighbors started manufacturing in huge numbers, the prices crashed. Now, if we want to set up a polysilicon manufacturing facility, that is where we lack, by the way. Huh? Everything else we have in India.
That's right.
We know how to slice the polysilicon, we know how to make the cells, we know how to assemble the panels. We also have enough R&D and enough demonstration capability in thin film technologies. And I mean, crystalline silicon is one which we have been using for ages. The world has been using for ages. But thin film technologies, the so-called cadmium telluride, mercury cadmium telluride, all those technologies are there in India. But they are expensive. They are used only in the panels that go in our satellites because they're expensive. So polysilicon is, yes, one thing which we have somehow. We still can do it. We have the technology to do it. But to catch up with the scales at which the neighbor is manufacturing,
correct. Now, sounds very similar to the kind of catch-up we're trying to play on the semiconductor side.
That's absolutely right.
Right?
Absolutely right.
And I bring up that parallel because I think climate technology is at a point, whether we look at carbon capture, carbon storage, carbon utilization pieces that you were mentioning, or other pieces, right? How do we create fuel from waste, etc. Right. If India does not actually build out its technological manufacturing capabilities in many of these technologies that, much like solar, over the next decade will become increasingly important, I think we might again in 10 years from now be figuring out, okay, how do we create a semiconductor mission, but 10 years too late, right? So any thoughts either from anyone on the panel on the policy side now, and then I'll open it up for questions in a couple of minutes. But now I want to bring everyone in for a second. On the policy side, from an Indian standpoint, domestically, not so much internationally, what changes need to happen? One or two key changes that need to happen so that we don't actually end up making some of the mistakes that we might have made in the past.
With your permission, since you spoke about semiconductors, I'm sure the audience will know, I'm sure the fellow panelists might also know that there is a major national mission already launched by the Government of India in January of 2022 through the Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology on bringing semiconductor, we have the technology through the lab in Chandigarh, the semiconductor laboratory as we call it, in Mohali. We have always had it, but there is since we are talking about billions of dollars here, so $10 billion US has been committed by the Government of India. It translates to about 80,000 crores of rupees for bringing domestic capability to scale at international levels in India within a period of 3 years, as far as semiconductor manufacturing is concerned.
Correct.
So that's a major initiative of the government.
No, that's right. We've spent a lot of time over the last couple of days, obviously, on the semiconductor piece. Yeah. But I know, Sassoon, you wanted to come in, and then Varad.
I'll just be very brief. I think you mentioned about the lost solar opportunity. Every time there's a lost opportunity, there's an opportunity that hasn't actually been realised. And I think when we're looking at this space, there's constantly new opportunities arising all the time. I mentioned a minute ago about ecopreneurs. I think there will be the next wave of unicorns. There's a huge opportunity for government with private sector to see how to incentivise some of those organisations who are currently trying to solve problems now. And some of these will succeed and some of them will not. But you just need one or a few major successes to make it worth the while. So I think that's one of the things that I'm constantly all of us in technology is that there are constant opportunities out there that we haven't even thought of.
And they're constantly new waves.
We haven't
Absolutely.
even thought of them already, and they're bound to happen. We just don't know what they are yet.
No, that's right. And that's exactly my point, that you don't want to be in a position where you're already always catching the tail of the wave. At some point, on some tech waves, you want to be ahead. Varad.
Yeah, I'll tell you a few very specific ones. Okay, one is this question of finance, and Mr. Chakraborty, you were saying there's a lot of money now in climate change, but projects are a problem, right? And so I think there's one important thing is how do you unlock this capital which is coming in large amounts. In the early stage investing world where we sit, we use this term called valley of death of investing, right? Like we are seeing a lot of good ideas,
correct,
but they are not reaching the venture capital ready stage.
That's
so
right.
Can we create new kinds of patient capital funds, etc., that allow startups, ecopreneurs, to go from early stage ideas to VC fundable? So that's one very specific thing. Second, I'll say is this whole discussion on what is called a green taxonomy, which is really having clear definitions on what is an environmentally or climate friendly category of investment. I think the government of India has a group in the DEA which is working on this. I think the sooner we get that out, the more clarity it will provide to the market on what is counted, what is not counted, and lead to much more flow of capital as well. Third, I would say is go back to my topic of carbon market enablement. We should quickly pass the Energy Conservation Act amendments to enable the carbon market and set up a really good carbon market regulator, which is professional, digitally born. We have the experience of BE now to tell us how a good body like this could look like. That can be a major unlock. And lastly, my favorite topic, and linked to the topic of this, is we need a digital public infrastructure for measuring carbon and greenhouse gas emissions.
Correct.
I think these four things are the major policy unlocks we need.
I'm going to bring Ashutosh in next, but if we have some time left for Q&A, so please do line up in front of the mics if you have questions in the meanwhile. Ashutosh, I'll just come to you in a second. Varad, on the point of carbon markets, should it be a government-driven enterprise?
I think we need a good and strong facilitator and regulator for the carbon markets. That is a role only the government can play.
But should the carbon markets be set up by private players, or should it be set up as a government entity?
The market will have private players, right? The point is you need an enabler, a facilitator, to make transactions happen. That needs to have some sort of a blessing, right? Think of it more like a regulator like SEBI is in the securities market. You need a SEBI equivalent for the carbon markets. Now, SEBI is a government entity, but it's an independent regulator that is making that happen. We need a modern-day SEBI for the carbon markets.
Correct. But then do we let private players like, let's say, a Flipkart or an Amazon of the world come in and say, here's the most efficient tech-driven market that I set up, market platform that I set up?
Yeah, no, I'd love to hear the other panelists' views, but I think there are two streams of capital when we talk about carbon markets, right? One is the monies that will come if there is a global carbon market or a regional carbon market of some sort, which will be government-to-government flows, right? If that happens, that has to have a certain governance. But a large share of carbon market money is going to come through what's called voluntary carbon markets, where businesses are saying we want to be part of the solution. And that has to be a private-to-private thing, anchored by a strong regulator.
By a regulator. Ashutosh.
So just to the last point which was saying, I think we're trying to do the same thing, similar thing as a country, right? On digital platform for ONDC, for commerce.
Payments and commerce.
Right. We've done it for payments, we've done it for identity. You can do a similar thing from a private sector perspective, where everybody can chip in. And so that's definitely one thing. And just to delve a little bit more on the carbon perspective, I think so, from a policy perspective, it's important, what are you reporting? What are you monitoring? What are the carbon removal policies, carbon reduction policies? All of those need to come in tandem. And they need to be interoperable and similar in nature, so that you're not talking at cross purposes. Right? So those are some of the policies, etc. One of the other point which was said, and I want to, this interest in entrepreneurism and driving entrepreneurs is very important. But let's also understand that entrepreneurs jump in when they see an opportunity at the end. So that while it's good to have funding in, it's good to have opportunities come in, it's good to have build the skills required for these entrepreneurs, we need to be able to show them opportunities. And that's where the government also can play a very important role. Because if you see opportunities at the end of the tunnel, you will have people who want to do it.
Correct.
And my last point, which I'll come to in terms of a policy perspective, is while we're doing this entire movement towards different power sources and electricity sources, etc. Electricity is going to be an important piece in this perspective. We will move to other sources of electricity, solar, nuclear, wind, whatever it is, right? We need to not forget one important thing, which is electricity inequity.
Electricity?
Inequity.
Inequity.
We should not create a situation where, because of the cost of this alternate source of energy, there are going to be some pieces of or some parts of the citizens who will be left out.
Correct.
And that's going to be an important piece right from the beginning, which we need to build into the system when we look at our policy perspectives as far as this thing is concerned.
No, absolutely, absolutely. Though, of course, many of these new forms of energy like solar are inherently a decentralized form of energy production also. So you can actually have many of our remote areas that do not have access today actually become producers and establish microgrids, etc. But you're absolutely right, that has to be a key part of our...
And if you make it so costly that it becomes a fad, it becomes a fashion,
That's
then it really doesn't. And the last point, sorry, I just wanted to also think was, another policy thing, and I don't know whether it's a policy thing, but it's a educational thing, but it's about skills. It's about building the right skills, because ultimately addressing sustainability is going to be a way of life. So you have to change the way your business processes work. You need to rebuild, restructure all of that.
No, absolutely, absolutely. I know we have just a few minutes left, so I'm going to take a couple of questions from this side. And if I can ask, just in interest of equity, because I know you've also asked a few questions, can I start with the two gentlemen in the back? And then two here. I'll take those two questions quickly, and then I'll have the panel address them, then I'll take these two. And so keep your questions brief, obviously.
Hi, so my question is for Ms. Bharathan in particular. So the aviation sector in India is expanding, air travel is coming back post-COVID, Air India is expanding. Delhi airport's about to become the first airport in the country to have 4 runways. So in this landscape, from your perspective, what role can sustainable aviation fuel play in integrating itself with this aviation sector's rise and helping India transition to a net zero economy?
I'll take the second question as well.
So good morning, my name is Bhavjot Singh and I'm a GTS Young Ambassador from IIIT Bangalore. So my question is basically, like we are actually looking forward to the Semicon mission and also the net zero mission of India, but reports from the researchers of Taiwan clearly say that TSMC is it is actually the biggest emitter of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions in actually greater than any industry in the world combined also. So how are we trying to utilize that thing as well as the carbon zero mission in together?
Correct. So anyone of you want to take either of those questions?
I can take the second one. The second one relates to, you're talking about net neutrality when you're talking about setting up semiconductor fabs also in India. So see, the entire idea of net neutrality rests on the fact that, as I said, we cannot stop developing. India cannot stop developing. India has to march at a pace which is going to be faster and faster by the year. But while we do so, we do it responsibly, we do it in an environmentally benign manner. That is where carbon dioxide capture, utilization and storage plays a major role. That is how Niti Aayog is focusing on that alone as a major topic. While you continue to emit, you ensure that you don't emit to the atmosphere. You absorb the carbon dioxide through whatever means possible. There can be chemical solvents, there can be physical solvents, there can be underground sequestration, or you can capture the carbon dioxide and convert it into useful chemicals. I mean, you can convert carbon dioxide to methanol, you can convert carbon dioxide ultimately to green hydrogen. So these are the technologies that we need to continue to focus on, which we are already doing. But there, leave alone India, the rest of the world is also not at a commercial scale. So green hydrogen is being spoken about, it is being tried in various countries, but still not at prices which can compete with that of fossil fuels. So, I mean, while we continue to emit, we continue to develop, but we don't emit to the atmosphere is the keyword. We absorb the carbon dioxide and convert it into various useful technologies or various useful chemicals for that matter.
Does any of you want to take the first one, the first question?
So there are two parts to the answer. One is the tech piece and the other one's the policy piece. On the tech piece, where are we globally? Because it's important, because that's exactly where India will be also, which is that we as GE are partnering with industry initiatives to approve and adopt this 100% SAF right? Sustainable aviation fuel. What we're doing is we're participating in demonstration pilot programs for, say, a low or a zero carbon hydrogen combustion in engines as well. So that's the tech piece. We'll need to get that fixed, solved for, before we could look at a policy. The moment globally that is available, that's exact, whatever engines that in our suite of technologies that are available globally is exactly what India will also get. Because the airframers are the same, whether it's Boeing or Airbus or wherever they get fitted into. So the moment we solve for the tech problem, I think the second piece is what is an enabling policy framework that will incentivize. You have a pioneering technology. What would it help to have a transformational change in India in the aviation sector the moment the tech issue is solved?
We'll take one last question, actually, because our time's up. So we'll take that one last question from you.
Good afternoon. I'm Wasim Ahmed, the GTS Young Ambassador from Kautilya School of Public Policy. My question is on the EV sector. There's a lot of push towards the EV electric vehicle space in our country, and the Ministry of Heavy Industries is also coming up with a tax incentive structure for the EV sector. At the same time, there are a number of recent studies that show that electric vehicles are no less harmful than the conventional vehicles. So with respect to the mining process involved and the fact that they are again going to be charged by the electricity that is produced by the fossil fuel. So in that regard, are we truly moving towards sustainability, or are there any other alternatives to this?
I have a general comment on this, which is actually all three questions. I think the questions show the word that was used in the previous panel, that there is no silver bullet.
That's right.
This is a topic that cuts across so many things, whether it's hard to abate sectors like aviation, whether it's the link to unintended consequences of what you end up doing.
That's
that
right.
the complexity is very high, right? So to your point, EVs are not a silver bullet. Firstly, they are only 15% of the emissions. Secondly, if the underlying energy is from fossil, then you're really not solving anything. So that's why we need to keep chipping away at everything at the same time, and at the same time not ignoring the second order effects or the unintended consequences. You mentioned solar 10 years back, but that's the only thing I can say on this.
No, absolutely. I think we don't want to solve one problem and create a bigger one for down the line. For sure. Neeraj, you'll have the last word.
Just one more input to what my colleague just said. See, batteries are charged by conventional electricity, we already know. Batteries can theoretically and practically also be charged by using SPV, electricity generated by SPV panels, that also we know. But in the second part, the cost comes into the play, right? So India started, since I started my career in the Department of Non-Conventional Energy Sources, I can tell you we started working on EVs 40 years ago. Not many people know this, huh? And we had brought out the Reva car, which was by the Many Electric Group of Bangalore, around 25 years ago. And the Reva was then bought out by the Mahindra Group. It was called E20, and finally, I think it's been phased out, whatever. The only thing where we continue to work hard is to develop high energy density batteries. Now, that is where we continue to try and develop new chemistries, like for example, now nickel metal hydride went away, lithium ion is a little old. Now we are talking about iron air, we are talking about nickel air. There are different combinations we are talking about which are going to be very cheap and which are going to be taking much less electricity to charge at a level at which you can drive 200 kilometers in one charge. So that is all we can think of. We try to reduce our dependence on conventional electricity, but we cannot do away with that. So hence CCUS continues to remain the answer.
Correct.
Thank you.
So thank you so much for the questions, and for those questions that we weren't able to get to, the panelists will be around, so please do find them offline over lunch. I'll thank all our panelists. I think in a short period of time and with many perspectives, we managed to touch on some of the pieces of that framework that I had outlined earlier, the tech piece, the finance piece, the policy piece, the strategy piece. There's, I think, always new niches, new waves for India to try and capture. And I think to the questions, I think the learning that I think, Bharat, you mentioned, that the problems, the solutions are usually not silver bullets. That itself, I think, is an opportunity that countries like India, I think, can capitalize on. I'll end with one piece. I think the piece that we didn't get to was the behavior piece. I think Prime Minister Modi has talked about it within this framework of life, where consumer behavior inherently will also need to change. This is not a problem that is a tech-only problem or a finance-only problem. And I think yesterday when we were discussing this consumer behavior piece, we'd come up with this idea, and I've written a little bit about this, that we, much like a Startup India movement that has catalyzed India's startup ecosystem, obviously, over the last several years, we do need a very broad-based Climate India movement that makes it a whole of society, whole of government effort, so that many institutional pillars of our government, our corporates, our think tanks, our philanthropies can come together to help India transition, make this net zero transition faster. And with that, let me thank all of our panelists. If you can have a big round of applause for all of them. Thank you very much.